she said. We should end this relationship. I can't spend my youth with someone who has nothing. Then she left with another man. I replied, I wish you the best. After that, I started focusing on building my future. A week later, she suddenly called me crying. She said it without hesitation. We should end this relationship. I can't spend my youth with someone who has nothing. Those words landed harder than the silence that followed. We were sitting at a small cafe table, the kind where couples usually whisper about plans and dreams. Instead, I watched her slide her phone into her purse and stand up like she had just finished a routine conversation. Through the window, I saw a black car pull up. A man leaned casually against it, smiling like he already knew the outcome. She walked toward him without looking back. For a second, the world felt strangely quiet. The clinking cups, the chatter around me, everything blurred into background noise. When she turned briefly, maybe expecting anger or begging, I simply nodded and said, I wish you the best. She left with him. And in that moment, while everyone else thought I had lost everything, I realized something important. I had just been given the perfect reason to build a life she would one day regret walking away from. I wasn't always the kind of man people noticed when he walked into a room. Back then, I was just the quiet guy with worn-out shoes, a second-hand laptop, and big plans no one really believed in. I worked long hours at a small logistics office during the day and spent most nights teaching myself business and finance through free online courses. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest work. And to me, it was the beginning of something bigger. She had been part of my life for 3 years. When we first met, she loved my ambition. At least that's what she said. She used to laugh at my late-night ideas and call me her future millionaire. But slowly, the jokes stopped sounding supportive and started sounding like doubts. You think too big, she'd say sometimes. Be realistic. I noticed the way her friends looked at me when we went out. The polite smiles, the subtle glances at my simple clothes. To them, I was the boyfriend who hadn't made it yet. But I never argued. I never tried to prove anything. I just kept working quietly, believing that time would eventually speak louder than words. What I didn't realize back then was that some people don't wait for the future. They only respect what you already have today. The disrespect didn't arrive all at once. It crept in quietly, almost politely. At first it was small things. When we went out with her friends, she started introducing me differently. Not as my boyfriend, but as a friend who's still figuring things out. She'd say it with a soft laugh, like it was harmless. But I noticed the quick glances people exchanged afterward. One evening at dinner, her friend asked what I did for work. Before I could answer, she cut in. He's working at a small office for now, she said, stressing the words for now in a way that sounded less hopeful and more apologetic. Everyone nodded politely. I just smiled and kept eating. Another time, we passed a luxury apartment building downtown. She slowed down, staring up at the tall glass windows glowing in the evening light. Imagine living somewhere like that, she said. I told her calmly, one day maybe. She didn't laugh this time. She just looked at me with a strange expression, half pity, half disbelief. The moment that stayed with me the most happened at a party. I overheard her speaking to someone near the balcony. He's a good guy, she said quietly. But sometimes being good isn't enough. I stood there in the hallway, listening to the music and pretending I hadn't heard a word. But something inside me had started to understand exactly where I stood in her world. The night she left with that other man should have broken me. Instead, it clarified everything. For a few days, I replayed that moment in my mind, the cafe, her words, the quiet judgment in her eyes. Not with anger, but with a strange sense of understanding. She hadn't betrayed me in a sudden moment of cruelty. She had simply followed what she believed about me. In her mind, I was the man who would always be almost something. And that realization changed the way I saw my life. The following Monday, I walked into the small logistics office like any other day. Same grey walls, same humming computers, but something inside me had shifted. I stopped treating the job like a temporary step and started studying every part of the business. How contracts worked, how shipments were negotiated, where companies were losing money. Within months, I noticed patterns others ignored. Late nights became strategy sessions. Weekends became planning days. Quietly, I started building connections with small suppliers and transport companies who felt overlooked by larger firms. No announcements, no dramatic speeches, just consistent work. For the first time in years, I wasn't trying to prove anything to her or anyone else. I was simply building something real. And the strange thing about quiet effort is that eventually, it becomes impossible to ignore. Success didn't arrive overnight. It arrived quietly, piece by piece. While others in the office rushed through their tasks, I paid attention to details most people ignored. I learned how contracts were structured, how shipping routes were negotiated, and where delays cost companies thousands of dollars every week. After work, I studied business agreements, logistics regulations, and supplier networks until late at night. Eventually, I noticed something important. Small manufacturers were struggling to move their products efficiently. Big logistics companies ignored them because the profit margins were smaller. But when dozens of those smaller contracts were combined, the numbers started to look very different. So I made a plan. Instead of chasing large clients, I started building relationships with the overlooked ones. I visited warehouses after work, drank cheap tea in small offices, and listened more than I spoke. Slowly, trust formed. Within a year, I left my job and registered a small logistics brokerage of my own. Nothing flashy, just a desk, a laptop, and a network I had built quietly. The same people who once dismissed those smaller businesses suddenly noticed their shipments were moving faster and cheaper. My company's name started appearing in contracts across the city. I never advertised loudly. I didn't need to. The results spoke for themselves, and sometimes I wondered if she had noticed the name yet. The real payoff came almost 2 years later, on an ordinary afternoon. I was sitting in my office reviewing a shipment contract when my assistant knocked lightly on the glass door. "There's a client asking about a logistics partnership," she said. "A new retail company. They want to move products nationwide." I nodded. "Send them in." When the door opened, I didn't expect to recognize anyone. But then she walked in. For a brief moment, she froze. The same confident posture she once carried seemed to falter. As her eyes moved around the office, clean glass walls, busy staff, screens showing active shipments. Then her gaze landed on the small metal plate on my desk with my name under the title, founder and director. Her voice was quieter than I remembered. "I didn't know this was your company." I simply gestured toward the chair across from me. We spoke professionally. She explained that the business she worked with needed reliable distribution. I listened, asked precise questions, and reviewed their proposal like I would with any other client. There were no accusations, no reminders of the past, just calm, careful conversation. When the meeting ended, she hesitated by the door, maybe expecting something, anger, pride, anything. But I only said politely, "My team will review the proposal and get back to you." And for the first time, I watched her walk away uncertain. After that meeting, word spread faster than I expected. Not because I told anyone, but because business circles are smaller than people think. Within a few weeks, several companies reached out after hearing how efficiently our network was handling shipments. My team stayed busy, contracts kept growing, and the office slowly expanded into the floor next door. The change in how people treated me was subtle but noticeable. Suppliers who once spoke to me casually now prepared detailed proposals before meetings. Clients listened more carefully when I explained strategies. Even competitors who had ignored my company at first started watching our progress. But the most unexpected reaction came from people who had known me years earlier. Old acquaintances suddenly remembered my number. Some congratulated me with a hint of surprise in their voices, as if they were still adjusting to the idea that the quiet guy had actually built something real. As for her, I heard through mutual contacts that she had left the company shortly after our meeting. I never asked why. What mattered wasn't her regret or anyone else's opinion. What mattered was the quiet realization that my worth had never depended on their approval. For anyone watching this story unfold, the lesson is simple. Sometimes the strongest response to disrespect isn't confrontation. It's building a life so solid that the past quietly loses its power. Looking back now, I realize something important. Losing her was never the tragedy I thought it was in that moment at the cafe. If anything, it was the turning point that forced me to see myself more clearly. Before that day, a part of me was still trying to prove my value to someone who had already decided what I was worth. When she walked away, that pressure disappeared. The business kept growing year after year. New partnerships formed, new cities opened, and the small network I once built with late-night calls and warehouse visits slowly turned into a respected company. But the biggest change wasn't the office size or the contracts. It was the quiet confidence that came with knowing I had built it all step by step. Sometimes people ask me if I regret how things ended. I don't, because revenge was never about humiliating someone or throwing success in their face. The real victory was much quieter than that. It was waking up each morning with peace, knowing my life no longer depended on someone else's belief in me. And the strange thing about silent revenge is this: the moment you finally succeed, you realize you don't need revenge anymore.